All right, great, let's get started. This is lecture 3. And in terms of where we are on the syllabus, we had an overview of patterns of global and African economic development last week, and I'll finish off that discussion at the beginning of lecture today, and then we'll turn to a growth model and just use that as a framework to think about a lot of different topics during the course of the term. And then next week and the following, we'll focus on these big topics of geography, health, and development. Any questions before I get started? Sorry? Oh, the lights again, right. Just don't fall asleep. Oh, that's good. Can you see a little bit better with those lights off? Should I turn that one off too, or is that just, you guys are really, should get out the popcorn? Is that better though? You're not gonna fall asleep? Okay, no, don't let your neighbor fall asleep. I'm gonna try to keep it lively. But you can see the screen a lot better, I guess, like this, right? Okay. We'll give, yeah. Pardon? I see something over there on the wall. Yeah, I don't know how it works in terms of thermostat. Is that a thermostat over there? Should we turn that? I think there's just so many people in here. That's what I think the problem is. But if anybody has any ideas about that, if we could prop open one of these doors, I don't know. Sorry about that. Yeah, it's like dark and warm. Everybody's gonna be really cozy. Don't let your neighbor fall asleep. That's your goal. Okay, so let's just pick up where we were last time, and then we'll move on to some new stuff. This is just a slide we went through last time, summarizing some patterns of African development. As I mentioned, up to about 2000, sub-Saharan Africa was coming off of 25 years of very slow economic growth. Actually, economic growth was negative in per capita terms over the previous 25 years. That was really terrible economic performance. And just as contrast, India and China were at very similar development levels, say, in 1980, but they really pulled away by 2000. They developed really rapidly during those subsequent 20 years. But since about 2000, growth has been positive again. And that's really the very important recent pattern is per capita growth has been about 3% on average over more than a decade now, and that's starting to change the picture. And this was a figure that we discussed last time, showing these 3 different phases of African economic growth since roughly independence for most countries, which took place in the early 60s. So plus 2% growth, minus 1, and then plus 3. And as you can see, as we discussed last time, the Kenyan experience is broadly similar to the Africa-wide, sub-Saharan Africa-wide experience. So one of the key questions is what explains this turnaround. Why did growth improve over the last 14, 15 years? What happened? And in the existing research literature, and policy literature, there's a debate about those causes, and the debate typically centers around two different views. One view is that a big part of the turnaround was due to global economic factors. And in particular, the fact that global commodity prices were much higher after about 2000 or 2002 than they had been for a couple decades previously. A lot of these commodities, agricultural commodities, minerals, petroleum, et cetera, are produced in sub-Saharan Africa. So as their global prices doubled, tripled, or quadrupled, African producers did well. And a lot of observers point to economic growth in Asia, in China, in India, as major drivers of those higher commodity prices. So this is really the external school of thought, that external economic circumstances, mainly global prices, were really the key in explaining the turnaround. A second explanation, which is not mutually exclusive, they could both be going on at the same time, is that internal factors were actually most important. So internal reforms, internal institutional change, internal policy reform, all of these things taken together led to changes in the economic environment in African countries. And one of the most salient institutional changes in African countries starting in the 1990s was the increase in democratization in many African countries. So there's a number of reasons why you might think democratic reforms would affect the economy. So on the most basic level, if we think that government officials' choices don't always reflect what's best for the economy as a whole. Government officials are sometimes corrupt. Government officials make mistakes. Government officials choose policies that may not be that great. In a democratic system, those officials can be held accountable for their choices. So if I'm discovered to be really corrupt, I can be voted out by voters in the next election. If I do something that benefits me or benefits my party or benefits a subgroup of the population, but hurts the majority of the population, well, in a democracy, the majority of the population can choose not to re-elect me next time. So the democratic process, really elections, provide a form of accountability that may, in theory, improve policymaker behavior, because now they have strong incentives to do the right thing or else they'll get voted out. So there's a kind of clear mechanism. What are some other reasons why you might think democratic reforms could either improve economic policy or actually lead to worse economic outcomes? What are some other ways these institutions might matter? Yeah. So that's a very interesting view. Democratization can affect your relations with the rest of the world. It's certainly true that more democratic countries, at least in theory, get more approval from USAID, from the World Bank, et cetera, as long as you vote for the right people, presumably. Sorry, a little side comment. But yes, democratic countries that respect human rights, et cetera, in theory, should be seen as better members of the international community and gain more support from donors. At least that's one possible channel. Yeah. Right. So, a very interesting point. Could it be the case that democratization is destabilizing, or democratization actually exacerbates corruption rather than leading to more accountability? Now, when African countries became independent in the early 60s, within a few years, many of them abandoned the democratic institutions they had started with. Many of them became one-party states. And the argument that was used in country after country, at least the public argument, was in poor, underdeveloped, ethnically divided countries like new African countries, democracy is going to be destabilizing. Democracy is going to be divisive. What we need to do is build unity under one party and under my leadership. That's what the leaders all said. They wanted to rule, and they ended up ruling on average for about 30 years. There was a whole generation of dictators, African dictators, that ruled for 25 or 30 years until being overthrown in the late 80s or early 90s. So you have to wonder whether they were doing it for themselves or whether they were doing it because they thought it was the best thing for their countries. But there's at least an intellectual argument to say that having a one-party state and abandoning democracy might dampen some of the regional, social, ethnic, and religious divisions that characterize these countries. What are people's views on these different arguments? Yeah. So that's a very important argument in favor of democracy. If it's a well-functioning democracy, it really is, at base, a mechanism for transferring power without guns. So instead of 2 armies lining up and seeing who wins, voters line up, and whoever has the most voters wins. So presumably, if the democracy is stable or well-functioning, you would be less likely to have coups and violence and whatnot. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so I think the Arab Spring experiences and the earlier experience in Iraq, which is a few years before the Arab Spring, but may have some similarities, are situations where, say, Egypt is the canonical case. You have a situation in Egypt of relative stability for 30 years, political stability under a one-party state, a repressive one-party state, and then when democracy emerges, you have a lot more political violence and instability, et cetera, and military coups, and so that's one case where democracy has not led to more stability, and that could easily have economic consequences. So 5 or 6 years ago, foreign investors may have looked at Egypt and said, well, there are all these repressive elements of their politics, but it's stable, maybe I'll build a factory in Egypt. But today, many fewer investors would make that choice because they'd be afraid that their property won't be secure. Okay. So yeah, one more comment. Yeah, and that's a huge issue. So young democracies, new democracies, countries with new democratic institutions tend to be characterized by lots of vote buying, lots of corruption, as people figure out the rules of the game, basically. And with time, that can change. There are some very interesting cases of African countries that started off with very flawed democracies, but just in the last couple decades have moved towards much more established and fair democracies. I think the most famous case of this, or the case people always hold up, is Ghana. So, sorry. Oh, this pen isn't working well. Sorry. Ghana has now had, I think, 4 multi-party elections, maybe 4 or 5 multi-party elections. They've had multiple alternations of power. But the first couple multi-party elections were basically rigged, but each election has gotten fairer and fairer. But it takes time. These institutions take time to build up. I mean, it was only, think of the United States, which calls itself the world's oldest democracy. It wasn't until the 1960s that African Americans nationwide really had the right to vote. That's almost 200 years after the founding of this democracy. So that took a very long time to reach something close to a decent democracy, even in this country. So in Ghana, they did it in 4 election cycles, basically. Okay, so there's a lot of potential pluses or minuses to democratic institutions. The research that's out there is very interesting. Amartya Sen has a lot of work on India and says democratic institutions, maybe a lot of things in India, and certainly in India there's a lot of complaints about the imperfections of Indian democracy. But what you see is, in India, under democracy, very good responsiveness to certain extreme events. So when there is a threatened famine, the government in India responds. They have a system to respond. Politicians that don't respond get punished at the polls. There's been some interesting follow-up work to Sen's work by Tim Besley and Robin Burgess. Why is it doing that to me? Sorry. I swear, I'm not just writing. There we go. Tim Besley and Robin Burgess have a paper, maybe 2002, where they find something very similar, which is Indian states that have more democratic competition, that have more active media and newspapers, really where the mechanisms for political accountability are stronger, have even better responsiveness to threatened famines than other regions. So there's something about an active, competitive democracy that leads policymakers to have better performance. An example that Sen brings in is this classic comparison of India and China, really the 2 great giants of population in the world, the 2 great Asian giants. So in the 50s and 60s, when the democratic Indian government was setting up a very sophisticated famine response, that's when China had their great famine during the Great Leap Forward, where somewhere between 20 to 30 million people died of famine. Now, China in the 50s and 60s was a totalitarian dictatorship. There was no media to report about the famine. There was no accountability. It wasn't like Mao Zedong was, voted out the next year after the famine or anything, and he ruled until he died. So there was no mechanism in place for accountability for leaders who did terrible things, who had terrible economic policies. They just kept ruling. In India, you get voted out. And so the idea is, over time, that accountability may avoid the worst economic outcomes. So that's the idea behind Sen's argument. At the same time, and this is what some of you said, there's the possibility that a democratic opening breeds division, instability, at least in the early phases. Maybe over time, as democracies mature, less so. But this would be the case of Egypt, say, over the last 3 or 4 years, where a repressive but stable political system was replaced by a very unstable political system after.